Points of Clash is hosted by Finn O'Donnell. Episode 2, Tom Clonan.
It's Finn O'Donnell, and today I'm speaking with Tom Clonan, an independent senator on the Dublin University/Trinity Panel. He was first elected in 2022 in a by-election, and has most recently been re-elected in 2025. His experience ranges from a captain in the Defence Forces, a security analyst, and, as I've said, a senator. Today, I'll be discussing the Irish Defence Forces, research he's done on gender disparities, disability, and finally, the engagement of young people in politics. Tom, thanks so much for coming in to chat with me.
Thank you. Thanks, Finn.
How are you doing? Just start us off easy.
All good, yeah.
So what spurred your move into politics?
So I have 4 adult and teenage children, now university and living their best life. So one of my sons, Owen, he's 23. He's a wheelchair user. He has a neuromuscular disease. He has an assistance dog. He's partially sighted. He's in his final year now in Dublin Business School, DBS, where he's studying applied social sciences. But as a family, having a disabled member of the family, just you are aware then of just how out of step with the rest of Europe Ireland is when it comes to disability and disability rights. So in Ireland, for anything to do with disability, whether it be getting a proper wheelchair or getting personal assistance supports or any of those very basic things that would be automatic in any other part of Europe, you have to fight for everything in Ireland. So we're the only country in the European Union that has no legal rights for its disabled citizens. We're the only one. So that experience of having to fight all the time for things, advocate, campaign, just pushed me in the direction then of running for election. So I ran for election to the Senate as a protest to highlight issues around disability and disability rights. And unexpectedly then we got elected. So now it's been a steep learning curve.
And so you mentioned that it's largely about disability and campaigning on differential needs, things like that. But what are the specific actions that government can take to progress the needs of differently abled people and people with special needs?
Well, Ireland is a pathologically ableist state. So the government doesn't really have any interest in vindicating the rights of disabled citizens. It has ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in October 2024. But in the previous government, the Minister of State with responsibility for disabilities and the Minister for Children, Education, Disability, Youth and Integration, they both told me quite clearly that they did not support giving disabled citizens socioeconomic rights in law. Minister O'Gorman, as he was then, Roderick O'Gorman, told me that he felt it would be irresponsible for a government to give such rights to disabled citizens because there would be a cost implication for the state. And also during the lifetime of the last government, they proposed 2 constitutional referendums, one on care, which would have made the family and family members the primary and exclusive providers of care for disabled citizens. So that would have given constitutional expression to the idea that the state doesn't have responsibility for disabled citizens. And so that's where we're at with this, with government. So we have a long way to go to bring ourselves into step with the rest of the European Union. So Ireland is about 30 or 40 years behind the rest of the European Union when it comes to legislative rights for disabled citizens. So to that end, in terms of what we can do, I have framed legislation and drafted legislation and introduced legislation to change that, to bring us into step with the rest of Europe.
Yeah, and it's a very noble cause. However, it largely seems that in Ireland, the advocates for those to change the space for people with disabilities, that's often people with disabilities themselves or the friends and families of those. But how can we change this narrative to become a more broader movement? Is there any method that we can use?
Well, just protest, and it has to be a very noisy, radical campaign. And the narrative has to change around disability. We have to go from a charitable model which sees which is the one that's dominant in Ireland, along with a medical model, which sees disabled people or presents disabled citizens as a problem, people who need help. When actual fact it's a whole of society issue, and it's a fundamental human rights issue. And Irish people are good on fundamental human rights. We had a marriage equality referendum which vindicated the rights of the LGBTQI community. We have had the women's reproductive rights referendum, which vindicates the autonomy and power of women. So, and Irish citizens did that not because they felt sorry for women or the LGBTIQ community, or because they thought they were doing them a favor. They did it because it was the right thing to do. And we need to do the same thing around disability rights. We just need to get into that kind of narrative space. It's a fundamental human rights issue.
Sure, yeah. So a lot of what I'm trying to do with this project and with this podcast as a whole is try to help people understand politics in Ireland. So we're going to get into more things, but firstly, what does a senator do, and what are the powers that a senator has?
So we don't have any power. We're public servants. We're servants of the people. So in terms of what we do, I mean, how long do you have to try to explain that? So look, I've been elected 3 years at this stage, and so I've learned a lot in the last 3 years about what happens in Leinster House. So it operates in a number of levels. As a senator, you can draft legislation, which I have done. I've drafted 2 bills and introduced them. I hope to have my first bill, the Disability Rights Bill, put in its final stage in July of 2025, which would be a great achievement for disabled citizens. So we can introduce legislation. Everything that goes through the Dáil, the lower house, all of the legislation passes through the Seanad, or the upper house. So we debate, so we can draft legislation ourselves, or on a day-to-day basis, we discuss, debate, and seek to amend all of the legislation that goes through the house. So it's kind of like oversight of what happens in the Dáil. It comes through the Seanad for further reflection, and we can amend legislation meaningfully. And unlike other governments and other parliaments around the world, it's not very polarized. So in the Seanad, if you come up with a good, sensible amendment to legislation, sometimes government will actually take that on. So, for example, in the Universities Act, I submitted an amendment to make sure that students at third level were not just observers on the boards of universities, but that they actually had voting rights on the boards of universities. And the then Minister for Further and Higher Education, Simon Harris, he thought that was a sensible amendment. He wanted to know that students would still have a say in the running of universities, like a meaningful say. So he allowed that amendment to be incorporated into the legislation. So you can make a difference in that way. Yeah. A lot of my work and a lot of the work of other senators comes from our constituencies. So I was elected by Trinity graduates. There's about 100,000 Trinity graduates who are registered to vote. So I get some correspondence from them looking for help with different things. But I also get a lot of correspondence from disabled citizens and families, carers, people who have some experience of disability, looking for help. And so that's what I spend a lot of my time doing, is working on what are called representations for disabled citizens. And we also engage with civic society and other things to, try and get feedback from civil society groups, non-governmental organizations, to see how we can better frame government policy. And then the last thing, I mean, there are a lot of things that we do, but a very important thing is joint Oireachtas committees.
Yeah.
So in the last government, I was on the Disability Matters Committee and also the Disability Integration Youth and Children's Committee. So you do a lot of work there, bringing people in, getting them to give evidence or be witnesses about how government policies are being put into effect, whether it's effective or not, holding people to account. So it's a very, very busy sort of work schedule.
Yeah,
but it's a huge privilege to be able to do that on the part of others.
Yeah, And so you mentioned there that you were elected for the university panel, the Trinity Panel. And that is something that whenever we emerge from a new Senate election cycle, there's often some controversy on. There's calls for Senate reform or Senate reform, and specifically for these like university panels. Can you explain very briefly what these calls are for?
So obviously the Constitution was drawn up in the 1930s, and it does need reform. And I voted for reform of the Shannon in the referendum, the last referendum. That reform hasn't taken place. There's a very good report. It's called the Manning Report, which sets out how we could better reform the Senate to make it more, if you like, democratic and open to more like all Irish citizens should be able to vote for their senators. It shouldn't be administered on the system that it is at the moment. In relation to the Trinity Panel, the last election in January 2025, that's the last ever Trinity election in the history of the state, because that has been reformed. So we now have a university panel which consists of 6 seats. So all university graduates, DCU, TU Dublin, UCD, Trinity, NUI Galway, Cork, Maynooth, everywhere, University of Limerick.
Yeah.
They'll now be able to vote in the next election for the Shannon.
Yeah. So there is a certain hope that we might then see further Shannon reform in the future. So to get on to what you did kind of before you became a senator, you were a captain in the Defence Forces, and I actually got to hear you speak about this, your research into gender disparities, and you campaigned against these gender disparities in the Defence Forces. Firstly, why was that, and what progress has been made since you did that?
So I joined the Defence Forces in 1989 as a graduate of Trinity. I went into the cadet school and did my officer training. That was very demanding, psychologically, physically. It's very, very tough. Was commissioned as an officer, and then I did all of the things that a professional officer in the Irish Defence Forces will do. I served overseas in the Middle East. I served in the former Yugoslavia at the end of that conflict as an election supervisor. And prior to the Good Friday Agreement and the ceasefires, I served in what we call aid to the civil power operations or armed support operations for An Garda Síochána during the latter part of the Troubles. So it was a very interesting, very satisfying sort of career. And, you know, I felt at the time as a graduate, I was doing something to help improve security and freedom of speech and the economic security of the state. So it's public service. But I mean, it is a very interesting and exciting career. When I came back from the Middle East, I decided to do a PhD. So I did a doctorate, and I focused on the experiences of my female colleagues. And unfortunately, that doctoral research, uncovered very high levels of discrimination against female personnel in the Irish Armed Forces, and also very high levels of bullying, harassment, sexual assault, and rape of my female colleagues. So just to give you an example, I interviewed 60 of my female colleagues. At the time, there were about 300 women in the Defence Forces, so 60 was a large maximum variation sample. Of that 60, 59 reported some form of sexual harassment, sexual assault, up to and including rape, 59 out of 60. So that was a major problem for the Defence Forces, for the general staff. I reported my findings. I was awarded my doctorate, and that's when things took an unexpected direction.
Yeah. So there was not a positive response, let's say, from the Defence Forces at the time. And when it was proven that this research that you presented was true, has there in the last 20 years been progress made that you know of to make the Defence Forces a more progressive, maybe inclusive space for women?
So as you say, the military authorities, the general staff, when my research was published to the university, in the academic repository, they were very angry at the findings. But instead of dealing with the findings and trying to end the sexual violence and discrimination in the Defence Forces, instead of doing that, which is what they should have done and which is what I expected them to do, instead they embarked on a campaign of reprisal against me. So they tried to destroy my reputation and my credibility in order to undermine the findings of the research.
Yeah.
My research was investigated by an independent government inquiry called the Study Review Group, which reviewed my work. And that reported in 2002 and basically vindicated all of my findings and recommendations. I would like to say that the military authorities implemented those recommendations, but it would appear to be the case that they haven't, because in 2021, a group of women came forward, the Women of Honour, and made fresh disclosures of discrimination, harassment and sexual violence. That was investigated by a judge-led independent review group, or IRG, and they published their findings in 2023. And they found that the Defence Forces, Óglaigh na hÉireann, remains an organisation that barely tolerates women, that is a highly discriminatory organisation, and essentially requires major cultural transformation. So as we speak, there's a judge-led inquiry into the Defence Forces. It's sitting at the moment. It'll probably report in the next year or 2 years. But finally, I would say now, after 25 years, the Defence Forces have probably begun to seriously deal with the transformation that was required. But one of the things that the independent review group highlighted again and again and again is a tendency in the Defence Forces towards retaliation. So anybody who highlights a concern about, it could be anything from unfairness in a promotion competition, to a health and safety issue, to an issue of overseas or operational concern, they're universal and common experiences, that of reprisal and retaliation. So that's something that the armed forces here have to deal with.
It's very disappointing to see that there hasn't been much progress made, and even if progress is starting now, it is after, as you said, 20 years. So to get on to something else you did, another thing to do with the Defence Forces, you served in the Middle East and Lebanon, as you said, with the peacekeeping contingent, which was set out by the United Nations, which kind of gives you a unique perspective on what we're seeing right now in a lot of Irish politics. We're seeing discussions on the need of a UN mandate in relation to the triple lock. As someone who's actually had a UN mandate for something that they've done, what do you think about the debacle that's happening right now?
Well, I think, so I was in the Middle East in the mid-90s, so that's 30 years ago. The world has changed. So I was on a classic UN mission of the 20th century, where you had, if you like, sanction or the permission of all of the warring parties to be there. So the Lebanese, the Israelis, Hezbollah all accepted on paper anyway that you should be there. But in the 21st century, the world has become a far more violent place. It's far more unstable. And it is particularly violent in the Middle East, with the genocidal actions that are being taken against Palestinians in Gaza, and also the ongoing war crimes that are being committed by groups like Hamas, illegally holding hostages. That's a crime against international law. It's a war crime. Hezbollah also continue to commit war crimes by firing missiles indiscriminately at the civilian population in northern Israel. And we have a government led by Benjamin Netanyahu that is carrying out the most extraordinary atrocities against innocent Palestinian men, women, and children, in a way that has changed, because there's no longer an attempt to conceal what they're doing. They're carrying out genocidal actions against ordinary Palestinians. So all sides to the conflict are now committing war crimes openly. And that's a different environment for peacekeepers to be in. Do I think we need the triple lock? I think the government needs to explain what they will replace that with. So they're talking about removing it, but they're not explaining what they're going to replace it with, which means that if you remove the triple lock, it means that any Irish government can send any number of Irish troops to any conflict anywhere in the world in the future by a simple government majority. And I don't think that that is a safe practice. I don't think that and I think it undermines, in principle, de facto, our militarily non-aligned neutral status. So I think Ireland needs a referendum on neutrality to have it put explicitly stated in our constitution that we will never become part of a formal military alliance.
Yeah, I actually had Deputy Sinead Gibney on. Her private member's business in the Dáil a few weeks ago was about a referendum on the idea of implementing neutrality in our constitution. So that's a very interesting link that you've made there. That's really interesting. Finally, want to ask you about the inclusion of young people in politics. So you've mentioned that you included an amendment in a bill about having university students sit and have a say in how the universities are governed. But what other methods can young people take to involve themselves or to learn about politics?
Well, it's like everything. I think young people are by force majeure are going to get involved in politics, because your generation has been failed by, I'm sorry to say, my demographic, in that, most young people now coming out of school after they're leaving cert or graduating from university cannot have the very, very modest ambition of either owning a home or even renting one that's affordable. So to buy a 2-bedroom apartment in Dublin or a 2-bedroom house in Dublin, you have to be in the top 1% of earners in the European Union. If you want to buy a 1-bedroom house or apartment, you have to be in the top 10% of earners in the European Union. So that's very dysfunctional. Ireland cannot house its population. Can't provide them with sociable, affordable, or secure homes. And that is, by definition, dysfunctional. It's a fundamental right under the UN Charter of Human Rights to have shelter or housing. We can't provide it. So I think for that reason, young people who won't be able to make all of the decisions that you need to make as a young person in your 20s and 30s about whether you want to have children or not, whether you want to start a family, what you want to do, how you self-actualize. So I think your generation are going to become radicalized and politicized around this and take the necessary action to repair the damage that has been done by, I'm sorry to say, people, Gen X have done a lot of damage. Like my grandparents, that generation, and my parents, they did everything in their power to give people like us access to education, housing, and a better life. And my generation, shamefully, have dismantled much of that. Yeah. And that's something that your generation are going to have to address.
Yeah. And that's kind of a shocking realization.
No pressure.
Yeah.
No pressure.
That's a shocking realization to have to make. But anyway, thanks so much for taking time out of the day to have a chat with me. Really, really interesting, a lot of the stuff you had to say.
You're very welcome.
Great.
The Points of Clash podcast is hosted by Finn O'Donnell. For conversations that matter, search Points of Clash podcast on YouTube, Instagram, or Spotify. Thanks for listening.